Hi, this is Susanna Ashton. Thank you so much for your interest in my book, A Plausible Man. When I first started that project, which was, 14 years ago, it's because I was trying to read testimony. I was trying to read about survivors, about witness, about people who thought that their witness mattered, that their voices mattered. And I found this and little known, I didn't discover it, but it was very little known book written by a man named John Andrew Jackson. It was published in England and it never really got distributed in the United States for complicated reasons I go into in my book. And so it had this very powerful insight into life in South Carolina under bondage, and then a little bit about his life afterwards. And it haunted me. His voice stayed with me. And I decided there was a much bigger story here. So I started looking into the story of his life, and well, that became the next decade of mine. I had to travel to several continents to track him down, to find out his adventures and his disasters and his triumphs. Some of the things that I found most touching about reading and learning and unpacking this sort of story of Jackson in documents was that after the Civil War, he returned to South Carolina, and he spent the next 40 years of his life traveling between sort of New England and the northern states, raising money, and then going back down to South Carolina with donations for the freedmen, with farm tools, with food to keep them from starvation, with clothing, with donations. He tried to found a school. He tried to create a church. He tried to create an orphanage. He tried to create a home for elderly people. None of those things really happened. But he didn't give up. He was just indefatigable. And I love that we have a story of this full, long life in a way that you rarely hear. He was absolutely dedicated to try to sort of weave our nation back together. He also had this sparkling, big, bold, crazy personality. Everybody who met him said that he was a talker. And maybe that annoyed them, or maybe they found it charming, but he was hugely charismatic. And this big sort of in-your-face personality, that little bit of hustle he had, honestly, was what allowed him to survive. He would talk back, but he got through things. He was arrested multiple times unjustly. And he even escaped from a chain gang in later life. It's an astounding story, and yet almost completely erased from our nation's history. The connection you have today is, one of his descendants. When I first started working on Jackson, I tried to figure out what is his name? How come we can't find out anything about him? And it seems that Jackson may have actually been like a first name, and then when he escaped, he started using it as a last name. But he mentioned early in his book that his father, his beloved father, was known as Dr. Clavon, and Dr. Clavon was had learned the African methods of curing snake bites, and therefore was sort of called a doctor among the Black communities of not just his plantation labor camp, but the nearby ones, all in Sumter County. And he had this huge status. I mean, white people probably didn't know anything about this, but this was very important to Jackson, his family, and his community. And they actually used the name doctor as a first name. So I began to look into, what is this name Clavon? Was that a misspelling? And I quickly became to realize that the Clavon family, spelled in a number of different iterations, Claiborne, Clyburn, Clavon, are all connected. And many times there is a baby who is named Doctor in sort of different generations. And each generation, of course, they think they're naming somebody after their grandfather or their uncle or their father. But actually, the original doctor can be traced all the way back to a man who knew how to cure snake bites and protected and held up his community. I actually learned, and I mentioned this in the book, one of my favorite details is Dr. Clavon, the father of John Andrew Jackson, who had a long and hard, difficult, terrible life perhaps, but he lived to the end of the Civil War. He was emancipated. He outlived all his enslavers, and he even registered to vote in the last years of his life. So I love to think of Dr. Clavon triumphing like that. Anyway, it's a long story, but it's a fun story, and I tried to make it accessible, I hope, to people, to embolden them to find their own ancestors and research and stories. Each chapter I talk about a document. Maybe it's a census piece, maybe it's a receipt, maybe it's a letter. And I try to say this is how you can read it when you're looking for people who are often left out, right? Um, Documents don't always name enslaved people. How do you read for that? How do you understand people who are on the margins, women, people of color, people who are poor, and of course the enslaved? Standard documents and, unless it's an arrest record, aren't really set up to handle that kind of story. So I hope that encourages and emboldens people to think that looking up stories for yourself is possible, looking up ancestry, finding how to unpack sort of the hidden behind the scenes stories of our culture are there for everybody. So thank you again for your interest in this story, and I hope you find it as beautiful and brave as I did. Thank you.